representative from the group of Latin American accounting standard setters. So welcome, Bill. I think we have a representative from India joining us, but as you said, Karen, not yet online. I think everybody else has probably been in various of the meetings in the past. So thanks very much, everyone, for joining today. I think it's probably almost our first sort of serious meeting in terms of really starting to set standards. I think, you know, we've got a good meeting in prospect. It's a lot to get through. So I think, you know, as in terms of sort of just operating process, obviously there will be plenty of comments in terms of drafting. And as the Secretariat has said, unless it's sort of something that's of major, you know, issue of principle, if you can pass those comments through offline outside the meeting, that would be really helpful, and that will keep us sort of on track in terms of focusing on the issues of principle, and there are plenty of those for us to discuss today. Karen, anything you want to say before we sort of get into the meeting proper?
No, I think you've given us a preamble to. I will at the end want to just come back to future meetings, and particularly the meeting at the end of September, beginning of October, but I'll save that for the end, if I may.
Okay, that's good. And we, as said on the agenda, we'll take a break sort of midway through. Obviously, that'll depend on how we're progressing through the items. So, you know, but I'll try and sort of time it roughly midway through. The only other thing to say is that we have got a hard stop on the item on the reporting entity because Sarah's got a commitment elsewhere. So that's the reason, both for the positioning but also for the timing. So we will need to be we'll need to move on wherever we've got to in our discussions at that stage. So with that, Karen, perhaps if I can pass back to you in terms of the project update paper.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ian. So this paper is a bit of a wrap up of kind of what's happened since we last met. And I think there was just a couple of updates in there, but also some developments in our thinking. So we've shared with you that we've issued the project annual report that captures years from October to September. We've also updated you on the feedback to the consultation paper that went, I think, really well in terms of people who attended the feedback event. We're also confirming in the paper our intention to call the guidance IMPAG, International Non-Profit Accounting Guidance, and we've kind of soft launched that through the consultation feedback session. And we've also been developing our thinking around the roadmap to the exposure draft as well. And there are a couple of points related to that as well. I'm not going to go through the paper in the interest of time. I'll take it as read, but just picking up on a couple of things in there. On IMPAG, you'll see that we're now looking to issue the first exposure draft in November rather than September, which was our initial thinking. And that's reflective of the updates to the timetable for the exposure draft for IFRS for SMEs, to give us an opportunity to make sure that we are dovetailing with that, and we understand where we've got differences. So that's an element that has changed since we last met. We've also been thinking about the structure of the guidance as well. I think when we previously discussed it, we talked about 3 volumes. We're now expanding that to 5 volumes in terms of what might be authoritative and what might be non-authoritative. Having said that, with it being a digitally enabled piece of guidance, we're expecting elements of that to be invisible. Clearly, we need to distinguish between authoritative and non-authoritative, but just setting out our thinking around that and the roadmap. This paper also covers how we're thinking about dealing with the chapters that we're not updating in the guidance. And I know that's been a topic of conversation before about how do we do that. This paper describes in Annex C how we might go about that as well. So those are kind of the main points in the paper, and I think there's 3 questions that we've outlined in the paper. The first question is about the 5 volumes. Does that cause anyone any concerns? Second question is about the use of examples in the guidance. How far do we go with that? And the slant we want to put on the basis for conclusions. And then the final question is about that roadmap with the chapters and views about the way we're going to go about that. So, Ian, can I hand back to you in terms of that outline?
Yeah, thanks, Karen. And just to welcome Srinivas, who's joined whilst you were doing your introduction. And also I saw Tamba as well. So great that you could join us, Tamba. So at that stage, we'll just step through the discussion against each of the 3 questions. So maybe if I can take comments then on the structure points in terms of what Karen's described as 5 volumes. Yeah, Jenny, start us off, and then Bernard.
Thanks, Ian, and hello everybody. I suppose in terms of the 5 volumes, obviously the core guidance, basis for conclusions, and some examples or application guidance in the middle, that seems very sensible. I guess I just wasn't quite clear on the distinction between the authoritative guidance, the implementation guidance, and the implementation examples, and maybe that will become clear as we see drafting of various sections, but it wasn't immediately clear how we were deciding what went into each of those, and whether therefore we did need 2 different levels of guidance, for example. Thanks.
Thanks, Jenny. So what I'll do is I'll just sort of take a round of comments at this stage and then go back to Karen, and if you can respond to the points raised. So I've got Bernard, then Bill, then Tamba and Catherine.
We can't hear you, Bernard.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
We can, yes.
Yes.
All right. Sorry about that. No, I just wanted to say I agree on the elements. I mean, basically that's what you can do in the literature. I just wanted to kind of caution a bit on that we have a clear process on how we're going to use that, because it does add complexity, and like it's already been mentioned, I mean, sometimes it's hard to distinguish between, let's say, application guidance and implementation guidance, and we can spend a lot of time arguing around that. So maybe we can also think about using it by exception, so to speak. So if really every topic needs all of those, I would doubt that. So that we have kind of a clear thinking around when we actually step into a more detailed level of guidance. I think that would be extremely helpful.
Thanks, Bernard. Bill, over to you, and then to Tamba and Catherine after that.
Thank you. I just wanted to caution about publishing separate volumes for items that are authoritative. That is to say, as in the ISB, Part A is the core guidance and the application guides. They always go together, because unfortunately you will see that people won't always go to the something that is separated, that is, and they can be confused about what is authoritative and non-authoritative. So I caution against separating in separate volumes. Now, if it's all online, maybe that's okay, but even then, people will not go to that. And I know that for example, in Mexico, when we draft our standards, the application guidance is often actually pulled out of what you call Annex B or Appendix B, and we put it into the authoritative guidance, because we're always struggling with making sure that people see all of what is authoritative. So I would just caution against keeping those separate. As far as I agree with the comment that 5 sections may not be applicable to every chapter. That's very clear. But I do worry about separating into two different volumes, authoritative guidance. People will go to volume 1 and they will never get to volume 2, and they could miss something very important.
Thanks, Bill. Tamba, welcome back.
Thank you, Ian. Good morning from Freetown, everyone. Okay, quick to the question. I think Bill almost addressed the issue that I was going to talk about. This is the issue of having many books or volumes. I don't know, yes, they will look voluminous, but my thinking is if you want to go further, yes, you can go to the back and get additional information. But I would rather we have far fewer books than particularly for when we'll be printing. And for some countries, like developing countries like ours, not everybody will have access to the internet, so it's good that people can have the volume as and when they want to refer to things is there. Just a point, but I think Bill made that already. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Tamba, and really good that you're keeping well despite everything. So all our best wishes for that process going forwards. So if I can go to Catherine next.
Sure. So like nothing too original to add, but I echo probably all the comments I heard previously, particularly around the complexity. I think, you know, we're aiming to develop something simple here. So having 5 parts and people kind of have to filter through is adding to that. And agree with the process distinction on our side in terms of determining what goes into the authoritative text versus non-authoritative. I know our board grapples with that a lot from an IFRS perspective and struggling to sort of communicate that to our stakeholders. So I think we need to be mindful of that.
Okay, thanks, Catherine. Karen, back to you for reactions on what you've heard so far.
That's really helpful feedback to hear from you, and something that I think we can go away and reflect on. I think it might be one of those things where we've kind of unpacked it before we pack it back up together again, recognizing that there's different strands to this. And we wanted to keep faithful to having a short piece of core guidance, because one of the advantages of using IFRS for SMEs as the basis is that it is a relatively compact standard, and so we wanted to be faithful to that. But a lot of the ask that we have for us is a bit more explanation about how to apply this in an NPO context. And we'd seen both of those elements as important and part of an authoritative piece of guidance. And then we were then thinking about, well, what is then additional to that, where we wouldn't, one of the things we're conscious of, people can be quite checklist based and compliance based in their approach. And if you have lots of examples, which is probably where we went to first, they can look for the example that's closest to them and then follow that rather than using any judgment. And so some of our thinking was around, well, should we be looking at implementation guidance as a way of helping people reach a decision and relying on fewer examples to try and avoid that? And, you know, so maybe there's a distinction between the two. So I say we may have gone through the process of unpacking this, and then as we go through and develop, we package it back up again. And I think it's absolutely right. We wouldn't have all 5 of those for every topic. I think it will be a bit of a pick and mix, but I think it is certainly helpful for us in thinking about what is the purpose of what we're drafting. Is it intended to be authoritative or not? And to what extent is it about helping people understand how to apply the guidance that's there, and to what extent is it an example of what's there? So I think the feedback we've had today for me, I think has been really helpful, and we'll go away and reflect on that. I think we'll still, in developing stuff, think about it in those elements and build it up that way, but I think it's something we can come back to when we get to sort of a nearer a finished good, in saying, well, actually what exactly are we presenting?
So thanks, Karen. So I think, you know, just reflecting on that, certainly, you know, I think I heard that sort of message from all of the standard setters who spoke in terms of if we are going to have different layers, then be clear about the reason why you know, there is a different layer and what that different layer is actually doing, so that not only are we clear in creating it, but our stakeholders would be clear in terms of how it's actually used in practice. And so in this issue, I think there's that sort of conceptual side to how are we structuring the thinking and how are we adding additional explanation, as you said, to try and avoid a rules-based approach. The other dimension that clearly does play in with this, though, is the format in which the guidance is eventually produced. And I think that's one of the things where clearly we'll need to progress the thinking in terms of the type of package that we're using to present the material, and then how that plays in with that, if you like, that theoretical. So, you know, it could well be presented in different ways anyhow through that. So I think those are probably the two dimensions that it would be helpful to sort of come back on. Jeff, further comments, and then I'm going to move us on.
Yeah, it's actually just a quick question, and the question is: or would we be planning to expose all 5 elements simultaneously when we do exposure drafts, or is some of the implementation guidance or examples for later on?
Karen?
So we are intending to include all
Okay.
5 elements as they relate to each of the topics in each exposure draft, so that you see the complete package in each one.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. And I think that sort of steps us on to the second question in terms of examples and basis for conclusions. And obviously some of the comments we've had already sort of start to move us into that area. Any additional points members want to make at this stage in response to the question Karen's asked? Not seeing. Oh, okay, Jenny.
Thanks, Ian. I was just thinking a bit more about, obviously, the idea of this is to be helpful and to provide guidance and advice where it doesn't currently exist. But I suppose, where's the boundary at which we kind of say, okay, we're not providing guidance on that? And I don't know if there's been much thinking around that. And I suppose that was making me think as well, are we it's difficult to know, but are we anticipating that once it's been issued, that obviously this would be the authoritative guidance, material and guidance, but whether we'd be anticipating others would provide additional guidance to, other bodies, to their members or whoever, or we're not really anticipating that, and therefore we are trying to sort of provide everything because there isn't going to be another source for information. Thanks.
Thanks, Jenny. Karen.
I was going to say somewhere between the two is probably my answer to that, Jenny. I think that we want to try and be comprehensive, because I think there may be limitations on what others might do to add to the guidance that we're issuing, but I think there are boundaries on what we can do, and so I think that we're going to inevitably be feeling our way through those boundaries, and there may be some questions that we come back to in terms of, is the amount of guidance we're providing sufficient or not? So I can envisage that will be a discussion that we come back to as an advisory group as we look at each of the individual topics.
Thanks, Karen. And I suspect also the other thing is, in going through the 3 exposure draft process, we will get feedback as we go through there, and I think it'll become clearer. Obviously, it'll vary between topics, but I think, in terms of the balance and nature of what we're producing, I think we will get a better feel for the reaction we're getting to that. That makes sense. Okay, so let us move on then to the third area And any reactions on that? I mean, particularly we've got the vexed question of what we do with the chapters that we're not focusing on at the moment, but would still be included in the guidance. And in some respects, that will depend on, you know, exactly the handling will depend on the software package we're going to use. But open up for comments at this stage. Yeah, Jenny.
Sorry, I'd lost connectivity for a minute there, so I hope I'm not coming in at the wrong point. So I had a question just on the outline of the guidance and the sort of lists of sections. And I just wondered, inevitably, I suppose, the new sections that we're adding in around grant expenses and fundraising costs, etc., are included at the bottom. And I just wondered whether I think narrative reporting being at the bottom is fine because that's a slightly different topic, but whether actually we should put the others in with some of the other cost-based sections. You know, we could put them, I don't know, after government grants or something as 24 ABC, so they're essentially located in the guidance, but you know, doesn't change the content. Thanks.
No, thanks, Jenny. It's a good point because obviously they are groups, and it comes back to that point about actually, do you move away from the numbering in IFRS for SMEs, you know, and renumber accordingly, or how do you actually do it? You know, do you group as well the chapters that we're working on and the ones that we haven't covered? And so there's I'm not sure there's a right way through it, but I think from a point of view of users, it's certainly worth reflecting on what on that point that you've made, and that might drive you towards a sort of you know, a different structure, but with a sort of concordance table or something like that. Any other points anybody wants to make at this stage? Okay. So Karen, I think some useful feedback there. Clearly this is going to be iterative both during the development of the exposure draft 1, and I think also as we go through the subsequent exposure drafts and we get stakeholder feedback.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So that's been really helpful. Thank you very much, everyone.
Okay, anything else you wanted to pick up at this stage, Karen, before we move on?
No, unless anyone's got any other comments or observations, there was nothing more that I wanted to pull out. Thank you.
Good. Okay, so let's move on then to our reporting entity, and that's over to you, Sarah.
Yes, thanks. Ian. Can everybody hear me? Brilliant. And thank you for rearranging the agenda for me, and that's really useful and helpful. Thank you. And thank tag members for their patience, because it probably would have been better at the end of the agenda. However, the reporting entity and control, I again will take this the report as read. I think an overall comment is despite not having a fast response rate, I think there were a rich amount of responses and a rich amount of detail, which helps us in developing the future exposure draft. And they were very interesting comments, and also very positive in terms of supporting our overall approach, I think. So looking at, as tag members will remember, there were typically 4 questions per section and some additional ones. So each section of this report looks at each of the questions. And then towards the end of it, we talk about work with the focus group and with the PAG at this last meeting, where we got even more interesting and useful feedback. So going to the description of the entity, which was typically question 1. Again, as I mentioned, there was 71% of responses agreeing with the description of the entity. And we had a rich response and support, and particularly good examples around operational structures such as fundraising. New Zealand model set up, there were 4 types of typical operational structures, which the consultation paper talked about. And a commentary that what we should what we didn't have in the consultation paper, although it probably was implicit, that need to talk about reporting boundaries, but that reporting boundaries were less clear in NPO typical type entities. Another respondent talked about accountability. That was quite important. And I think we can include that in the control models in either two alternatives which we suggested. In terms of question 1 for the reporting entity and control and branches, the disagreeing responses were in paragraph 3.5, indicating that not-for-profits are different operating structures. In Australia, there's a typical different approach to the reporting entity. It doesn't follow IFRS or IPSAS. Reporting entity will be hampered without associated consideration and consolidation, and the description doesn't adequately address fundraising entities. Detailed responses are included in the appendix, but I don't think that any of the issues in the disagreeing responses, other than possibly the one about the Australian one, actually precludes a treatment as set out in either alternative 1 or alternative 2 based on IFRS. The control models will fit all those issues, although I think augmentation of those control models with accountability and being clear about the reporting boundary will facilitate those discussions. So Ian, is that all right if I stop at question 1, or do you want me to go through the full report?
No, I'll just sort of take some opening comments at this stage, and perhaps also sort of, so yeah, let's just take a round of comments. I think also before we move then further into the paper, it might be helpful if Jan Chow or Michelle might be able to just give us an idea as to where IFRS for SMEs is heading on this, because I think that would frame our subsequent discussion. But I'll just take a round of initial comments. Freddie, if I can go to you first.
Thanks, Ian. And this is just to clarify that the comments in respect of Australia, so it doesn't sway wrong direction. Perhaps the Australian reporting entity concept that has been in place for years, and maybe it's somewhat unique. It's actually under revision, following the revised ISB's conceptual framework, and we changed it in line with the IFRS for for-profit entities, and we have a project to do the same, subject to consultation process for not-for-profit entities. So I think we should land where obviously ISB and possibly the rest of the world landed in terms of is the reporting boundary as opposed to definition depending on the users relying on the financial reports.
Thanks, that's very helpful clarification on that. Any other sort of opening remarks? Because I think that it's which way you get into it is really important. Not seeing any other hands at the moment. Jen Chow, would you be able to just give us, or Michelle, would you be able to give us a sort of idea as to where the debate is going on the IFRS for SMEs update?
Yes, yeah. Thank you. I think, just I think 2 elements in terms of, obviously, reporting entity is very important, because this is we need to define first and then to decide what kind of accounting treatment we should have for those NPO, those organizations. In terms of, second comprehensive review of for IFRS for SME standard, currently, first, I think we, as the Friedrich mentioned, that from ISB perspective, currently we are using same concept as we developed in the revised conceptual framework. So the concept, the basic concept of reporting entity and how to define the boundary of reporting entity is same as the conceptual framework which the ISB developed in 2018. Secondly, obviously we do have separate section of consolidated financial statement. So actually we introduce the same definition of control as defined in the in IFRS 10. So conceptually, the basic concept of the definition of how to identify the, the parent and the control is same as IFRS 10. So the basic concept align with the for IFRS standards.
Thanks, Chenchao. I think that's really helpful in terms of understanding the direction of travel on that, because in a sense, okay, obviously you're still working on the draft guidance at the moment, both at staff and board level. But I think it's sort of in terms of beginning to work our way forward. Clearly, we've got this, kind of which way do you go type of, or if you like, what's your start point issue for this guidance. And it seems to me that probably actually moving forward then, we should be on the working assumption that we're based around IFRS 10. And, clearly, as Sarah's pointed out as we go through the paper, there are some slight pros and cons depending on the alternative that you take, but probably there's not a drop dead reason to move away from IFRS 10 as a start point, if that's where IFRS for SMEs is going. I would just comment as well that the guidance that SASB developed for the public sector is also based closely on IFRS 10. So I think, probably at this stage, it's worthwhile just sort of testing that thought process in terms of, as a group, does anybody, have a significant disagreement with kind of using that as a working assumption and beginning to work from there? Bernard.
Thank you. And I'm not disagreeing. I was just wondering a bit when I was reading the comments from the constituents and the issues they flagged in terms of control, whether actually, if there are several entities involved in the operations, whether control is actually the norm or the exception. And I know we had this discussion around we're going to leave joint operations, joint arrangements for the later stage. But giving that kind of context, I was really kind of wondering whether it would make more sense to say, well, I take all my operations and I found them actually through joint operations and arrangements. And those who are kind of still in the mix, they get put to the test of control maybe, because if you do it the other way around, I mean, you come up with all these questions on control actually. And I was just wondering actually if that would be also a way to think about it, whether it's actually the exception that you really have control. But again, probably that's going to differ around the world, and I just wanted to share that thought with you, because I was always kind of coming back and forth on is it actually predominant kind of question for the MPOs, or is it actually something which would rather bother them if they have to do it with all the operations?
Thanks, Bernard. I mean, yeah, there is a general question there, and there's also a question about how we handle, if we're not picking up joint arrangements and so on at this stage, to how to signpost that. Karen, did you want to come in on that?
I think it's without trying to expand the scope of what we're doing too much. We do need to, I think about it and look at the touch points around it. I was really struck by a report that our PAG member in Australia shared with us on some work that they've been doing looking at how users use financial statements. And one of the comments in there was that actually sometimes consolidation, and I know we're not tackling consolidation, but it's a dynamic to this, can be unhelpful in terms of understanding what is going on, and actually they would get more benefit by seeing what the aggregation was rather than the consolidation. So I think there's a number of elements to this where thinking about that user the perspective, and it may be that in this ED we kind of frame those questions and perhaps answer them, but I think it's a really good point that you raise, and you know, it's always a bit dangerous when you touch these topics that you start with one thing and it kind of erupts into a whole load of other things. So I think we are going to need to be careful about putting some scope around it, and we don't get into a much bigger set of questions to answer, but I think we do need to examine it so that we're clear about where the touch points are.
Thanks, Karen, and yeah, that point I thought was well made, and you know, you could look at that as we might think how you approach segmental analysis in terms of you know, that point that was made there. Okay, I mean, I thought it was just useful to surface that, and Sarah, I'll come back to you in a moment when we've gone to Freddie, but I just thought it was useful just to get that context and perhaps a kind of, if you like, a kind of broad way forward, at least as a working assumption. Freddie, back to you.
Thanks, Ian. And I'm just picking up on Karen's point. I would distinguish, and I think we do, but I think there is a difference between what is the reporting entity, and it can be, I think, group, it can be parent, it can be branch. Then there is a concept of control, and then there is a question of consolidation. And so picking up on Karen's point, in our local project, and again, focus is different. The board was actually, or is being brave at the moment, at least for the purposes of a discussion paper, and we will consult on the option that entities will not consolidate, but will provide some summary of the financial information for, I think we are calling it significant relationships, which is kind of answer to the point Karen was mentioning, that sometimes consolidation is not helpful, and it's actually not, it's hard in many not-for-profit types of the engagement. But I think that's a consolidation. I think we are not saying that the control doesn't exist or doesn't follow IFRS 10 requirements. It's just control is control, consolidation is something else.
Thanks, Freddie. I think that's helpful to draw out those three different parts of the question. Sarah, do you want to move us on then?
Yeah, absolutely.
Tim,
In terms,
just coming, yeah, brief. Yeah, I think this is really interesting discussion, and I think somewhere how we can deal with the fact that almost like the whole rationale for consolidation from the private sector around rights, you know, ultimately to profits and so on, it has a completely different conceptual basis in the non-profit world, and so that needs somehow to be unpacked. But equally, actually describing some of these relationships can be informative and needs to be informative to the users of the accounts. And what's right, you know, I was just reflecting is quite a few, and I don't want to say it's a norm, but quite a few of these international federations of a non-profit, say like ActionAid, it's actually almost like counterintuitive, because there are obligations from the controlling entity to actually distribute funds down to some of these, you know, the subsidiaries, which would almost the reverse logic of a private sector entity that's going on. So it's really important that some of these relationships are described, but I'm not sure about consolidation being particularly useful.
Thanks, Tim. Bill, before I go back to Sarah.
Yes, just very quickly, this may be an opportunity to reconsider or address once again combined financial statements. If control is not necessarily what's needed, in Mexico, our standard on consolidation also includes a chapter or a section on combined financial statements, which really get very little attention in the current guidance. And this may be an opportunity to reconsider the possibility of, in the chapter on Consolidated, to talk about also the possibility and the desirability and the convenience of combined financial statements.
Thanks, Bill. Is that something you're able to share with the group? Because I think certainly I'd be interested in seeing that. bearing in mind the comments that have been made in terms
Sure.
of what we want to do here.
Yeah, I can try to pull together everything we have. Sure, I'll make a note of that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks. So Sarah, I don't think we've made your life easier, but move us on through. I mean, I think let's just talk through the issues. I'm also mindful of time and your hard stop. So back to you at this stage. And you know, if there's particular questions you want to focus us on, rather than bearing in mind time, rather than walking through sequentially.
Just to note though, although it's very early draft, but I have already looked at combined financial statements in the draft in both the section 2 and section 9, which are the current bit sections on IFRS for SMEs, but it can probably be augmented, as these things always can. So in terms of going to the next section, I'll go through this one quite quickly. The two alternatives we went with, of course, were a control model. Both of them, one was based on IFRS for SMEs and one was based on IFRS 10. In terms of the alternative treatments, 74% agreed with those alternative treatments and supported either an IFRS 10 or IFRS for SMEs alternative, and the two different models that are currently in extant standards. In terms of who respondents disagreed, there were quite a reasonably small number of those, but I think it picks up the themes that we've already spoken about, which is that control at the heart isn't perhaps an absolute, in that you should look at authorities' MPO's mission and outputs. That the control approach in Australia, although Freddie's already talked about that, is superior to the ownership based, and that it was difficult to identify the differences between the two options. And I think it is difficult because, as I'm sure everybody's aware, that actually in reality, although there are conceptual differences, the results probably aren't that difference between IFRS 10 and an IFRS for SMEs based approach, the old IS 27 based. And so those are the difference. I think in terms of what we've looked at, certainly control and accountability can be built into a reporting entity description. And that's what we've already tried to do, but I welcome any additional comments. And so welcome TAG members' comments on that section, i.e. had we addressed all the alternatives, which probably focuses on the comments we've just had, but I don't know if there's any additional comments on that. Shall I stop there, Ian? That's the sort of second bit.
Yeah. I mean, if we just pick up any additional comments. Bill, are you in on that? Or is that a hand from previously? Okay.
Sorry, I forgot to drop my hand.
Okay, anything else anybody else wants to add at that stage? Okay, move us on then, Sarah.
And then looking at the alternatives, again, we had a lot of agreement with those alternatives, and the same set of respondents disagreed for similar reasons. One interesting thing, which I think we've touched on already this morning, is having the regulatory context from a regional perspective. And Ethiopian respondents commented about the possibility that you might have a branch in an MPO, but if it was in an Ethiopian context, they would still have to report as reporting entity from a legal perspective. So again, and then what other respondents suggested in terms of alternatives was whether or not we added a rebuttable presumption in terms of the drafting, and that was omitted. And I think what we look at currently is there's already a rebuttable presumption in IFRS for SMEs, and there probably will still be a rebuttable presumption even under an IFRS 10 framework. And so therefore adding an additional rebuttable presumption is very, very difficult. Having two in the same section would be very confusing. So we're not suggesting doing that, rather describing the different scenarios where control isn't in a remuneration type framework or rewards type framework, where rewards are different to the economic ones that you'd get in a commercial entity. So I think it's whether that we should have a rebuttable presumption or whether or not the alternatives should be added to in any way. And at the moment, we're sticking with the two alternatives that we had in the consultation. We can look at others, of course, and then do we think that we should have a rebuttable presumption on what we think about regulatory issues? That's question 3.
Thanks, Sarah. So take comments on that. Also, if Chen Chao, if you have any additional information on what Sarah's laid out in terms of the approach and emerging approach on the rebuttable presumption, that would be helpful. Do you want to go now, Chen Chao, before I take additional comments?
Yeah, I just want to add one comment in terms of rebuttable presumption. Currently, IFRS for SME standard do have that rebuttable presumption. And when we conducted the second comprehensive review of IFRS for SME standard, currently, as I said, that we introduced the same definition of control as IFRS 10, but in order to help SME to apply that concept, actually we still keep that rebuttable presumption. So just to let you know that on this point. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that confirmation. I think that's helpful. Any other points anybody wants to make in terms of the sort of approach that Sarah was outlining there? Okay, I think we're good with that, Sarah. So if you can move us on.
And then an assessment of the alternatives. There was the majority of support for alternative 2, which is following IFRS for SMEs, which was 62% of the respondents, where 7% respondents, 27 respondents, 27% favoured the alternative 1, which is the IFRS 10 basis of reporting. The IFRS 10 basis preference is that it's conceptually superior. It doesn't have the bright lines response requirements. And actually, one of the respondents said actually having to look at the substance of the transaction made it clear in terms of what the responses are, what the control between the two entities might be, made entities think about it in more detail. In terms of following alternative 2, the majority of the responses here were about resource and capacity, and it was much easier to apply than the IFRS 10 basis of control. And this was taken forward, and I'll just jump forward another section if I might to PAG. PAG certainly supported that in terms of it allowing for easier judgments to be made. It was a more pragmatic response, obviously, and it was simpler. And in terms of resource and first-time implementation, it was considered that actually alternative 2, i.e. following the IFRS for SMEs was easier. And even then we did discuss what the framework would be. We discussed the ISB's tentative decision around IFRS for SMEs, i.e. going to IFRS 10, and notwithstanding that, PAG still thought that was the IFRS for SMEs was more useful. So our initial response was, because of all those issues and to make it a more stable platform, we would consider starting on an IFRS for SMEs, i.e. alternative 2, in accordance with the consultation framework, while building in where IFRS for SMEs didn't address the more MPO type approach, building in IFRS 10 type examples where the IFRS for SMEs limitations in terms of commercial entities sort of ended. So building in IFRS 10 examples, but starting principally on the basis of IFRS for SMEs. I thought, Ian, I'll go through the structures if I might, but as that's probably one of the key issues, not the only issue, but which alternative we use. Should I stop there as I built in? And just to know, our focus group didn't actually have a preferred alternative that was balanced on both alternative 1 and alternative 2.
Thanks, Sarah. So, I mean, it clearly is a sort of fork in the road for us, I think. It strikes me that in approaching this, probably the questions that have already emerged in the discussion are going to be really important, that we need to articulate a kind of conceptual approach to why consolidate, what the purpose of that actually is. and that probably is quite important to have that concept articulated. Then I think you bring that back to, does that fit with control, recognizing that the approach to control needs to be much more nuanced, if you like, in terms of the various different relationships and legal structures that you will encounter. So I think the question then becomes, actually, does that require a different approach to IFRS 10, i.e. what will likely be in IFRS for SMEs going forwards, or is it actually in the nature of the guidance that we provide, having articulated, if you like, the basic reason and rationale for presentation, or some form of group financial statements, if I can call it that. So perhaps I might just open up for comments if anybody wants to comment on, if you like, that kind of slightly fuzzy rationale. But I think we probably need to look at this in strategic terms, before we sort of move forward with developing guidance. Freddie.
Thanks, Ian. I was thinking, listening to Janjao and monitoring what the IFRS for SMEs project review does. That the recent decision, does it actually change a bit of landscape? Because the alternative 2, I think, was suggested prior to the decision to move to 10, and 10 in IFRS for SMEs language, plus rebuttable presumption, plus not-for-profit guidance. And we do have in our local SSB 10, which is IFRS 10, we have a appendix which attempts to provide, which provides guidance to apply the concept of control in NFP space, public and private. I think that combination can be quite powerful or useful, and I think it's also in line with the whole framework for this project, which starts with IFRS for SMEs. I think the question which we'll be dealing, I think, every time, which version of IFRS for SMEs we are basing off? Is it the one prior to the review project or before or after? I'm not sure whether, I can't remember whether that was explicitly decided, but if we are thinking about the entities that might be of the size that would be appropriate to apply SMEs, and then ISB is making the decision, well, we will move on from what's currently in SMEs to, say, IFRS 10 in SME language, would have to need, going back to your comments on conceptual ground, I think we will have to probably have a very good reason why not to, if that new thinking might be superior. And the rebuttable presumption is still there, and we can think how to adopt that for not-for-profit circumstances. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, thanks, Freddie. I think that's very helpful. I think the working assumption is that the guidance will be on the basis of the new version of IFRS for SMEs. And therefore, I think the sort of arguments that you were setting out there are certainly ones that, given that it's quite finely balanced in terms of the discussion within the pack, for example, and so on. I think we'd have to have a good reason not to go for an IFRS 10 based approach. And at the moment, really, I think that's, partly what we test that is just, can we articulate this conceptual basis better in terms of what the purpose is here? And then also, as you say, to look at it in terms of, okay, if that does still hang together, then in terms of the more nuanced guidance that will be required to apply IFRS 10, or frankly, an alternative 2, does that work as a go forward? Bill, and then Jeff.
Just quickly, I think that we need to be conscious going forward. We need to minimize the differences. I agree completely with everything you just said about there's got to be a good reason to not follow IFRS 10. In the IFRS for SMEs, the differences are not many, and over time they've been eliminated. And maybe in the future, there almost all of them be eliminated. I think we need to be careful and create as few differences from the full standards as possible.
Thanks, Bill. Jeff.
I agree with what Freddie and Bill just said. And I think a lot of this is going to come down to application guidance, or whatever you want to call it, application implementation guidance. And this is where I think we could particularly draw upon, I was hearing Freddie's example, the Australian application guidance. I think this is where we could really draw upon some jurisdictional guidance, because I think, you know, here in US GAAP, and I'm sure in some of the other countries as well, there's a lot of thinking and examples that have been done in this area. So I think that we can really move along with an IFRS 10 based approach, and then really make the difference in application guidance.
Thanks, Jeff. I think that, you know, that summary of those interventions, I think, gives us a good way forward on this. Sarah, back to you. Mindful that you need to depart any minute now.
Yeah, just to, if I could go back on that, because it's an important point, just to say that I think what practitioners, accounts preparers were concerned about, and the PAG group, and I'm sure that others will mention that, is the amount of judgments required under IFRS 10 is far more than is required under IFRS SMEs in the old IS 27 model. So just to make sure I'm arguing that and to understand, so I fully agree. I'm signed up to IFRS 10. I've been using IFRS 10 for a long time myself in the other work that I do. And yes, absolutely, it's a much better conceptually based approach, absolutely. But it's just because I guess a lot of these entities are small and the judgments that are required. So it's more mechanistic under IFRS SMEs than the IS 27 based approach. And that's the tension is the difficulties with the judgments required. Now it's more conceptual, there need to be more judgments. And that, I think that was where, say, PAG and certainly the respondents that responded to were concerned about using the IFRS 10 based approach. So absolutely agree, but I just wanted to flag that before we moved on, if that was okay.
Yeah, no, I think that's very helpful, Sarah. And I think, you know, again, it points to the, if you like, the overall structural you know, challenge for us. But I think that's where we need to be clear about the principles, and the principles should be those in IFRS 10. But then that's where the application guidance, I think, comes in terms of how would you address the issues that come through there, you know, but keeping it at the principle level rather than a rules-based approach. You know, I think that's where we need to test this using what goes into application guidance, but it may be a very, you know, a very good test case for, okay, if you can give the authoritative guidance, then what more do you need either way, by way of sort of implementation guidance, the how would I approach this kind of issue type of non-authoritative guidance and or implementation examples. And, you know, going back to Jeff's point, I think, you know, there are a lot of good examples that have been developed at national level. And I think in thinking about how do you, you know, put those together, that having a look at what's been done, I think would be very helpful. Because if there are some good examples out there, I don't think we should be proud about.
No, absolutely not.
Okay, Sarah, does that give you enough? You know, we could spend a lot longer on this issue, but you know.
Yeah, and the only other thing then is that we picked up on all the operational structures, one that were in the consultation documents, two that are in the consultation responses, and that then focuses on the report, the structure that we've got. We're looking at a bit of section 2, something in section 9, implementation or application guidance to facilitate that with some examples on structures. So that's just a broad approach that we thought we would use, and whether TAG members were content with that kind of approach.
I mean, I'm not seeing anybody disagreeing with that. Again, I think it's having got our overall approach to guidance and then thinking it through here, I think that will help us decide whether we've got the right material and in the right places.
Brilliant. Thank you all.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks, Sarah. Thanks everyone. I think that's was a very useful discussion. So obviously we're going to see that back, Sarah. So
Brilliant.
thanks for that, and we'll let you go at that point in time.
Thanks very much.
What I'm going to propose is we move on to the discussion around the preface. And we'll have that, and then when we conclude on that, then we'll take our 10-minute break. So Phil, over to you in terms of the preface.
Thanks, Ian. Can I just check in everyone can hear me? Yep, perfect. I am very conscious of time, so as with the other papers today, I will assume this has been read. Do appreciate that a number of documents were provided in annex, so hopefully you've been able to navigate them and understand the structure of what we've provided. So the preface paper sets out the key issues associated with the first draft of text for the preface section. Preface itself aims to provide users of IMPAG with overview information about the project, governance, and the basis of the IMPAG, with the basis for conclusions section also providing a summary of considerations that have been made during its development. So on that, if we could start with the first question, which is a sort of broad generic question about whether the tag considers there are any areas that may be missing from the IMPAG preface or the basis of conclusions, given its objectives.
Thanks, Phil. So take comments or reactions to question 1. Okay, not seeing any hands up, so I think we're fine to proceed on that basis.
All right, thank you, Ian. So a number of areas for discussion within the preface have been drawn out in the paper. The first is to do with the hierarchy of standards on which the IMPAG draws. So as we've been discussing previously, it is based on IFRS for SMEs, and then we're noting that it draws on IFRS and its conceptual framework, and then IPSAS and its conceptual framework before jurisdictional level standards and frameworks are examined. So the question, I think, for the tag here is, are the tag content with this hierarchy, where we have IFRS for SMEs, then IFRS, then IPSAS, then jurisdictional level? And should this hierarchy be included directly in the main text of the preface so that IMPAG users can see that explicitly?
Thanks, Phil. Okay, so to Bernard first. And then
thanks. Yeah, no, I agree conceptually with the outline of the hierarchy. I think to me it's still a bit unclear how it really will work in practice once you start applying the hierarchy, because I guess also IPSAS and IFRS have similarities, and strong similarities quite. And what we heard from constituents actually was some concern around basing it too much on a economic benefit driven framework like IFRS and IFRS for SMEs. I guess this is particularly in areas where it would come to measurement. So not topics we have touched yet, but they will come. So I guess the question really is on how strict is the hierarchy, or is it some sort of a horizontal element, or those kinds of questions, I guess. And where I struggled a bit was actually the question on the jurisdictional guidance. I mean, not to get me wrong, this is incredibly helpful to draw from that. But I was just wondering what this would do to the guidance if we kind of have a too strong national notion among certain chapters, certain elements of the guidance. So whether it might lead to some rejection, from some constituents because they feel it's sort of a copy and paste element of what some other jurisdictions are doing. So I would use it, but currently I'm not sure whether we should be explicit about that and kind of make too strong references to the one or another jurisdiction. But again, I think we had it in the consultation paper, so people know aware of where we're kind of drawing the examples from. But again, I think it's just a bit of a sensitive issue to me.
Thanks, Bernard. Jen Chow?
Thank you, Ian. I'm happy with the hierarchy. Just one observation in terms of the terminology of IFRS standard currently we are using. I think maybe you are aware that the IFRS Foundation has established the ISSB. So in order to make a distinction between the standard developed by the ISB and ISSB, currently when we mention IFRS standard, actually we have already changed the terminology. That is, the new terminology should be IFRS accounting standards, and the standard developed by the ISSB, that is IFRS, sustainability disclosure standards. So just let you know that the terminology has been changed. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. I mean, consistent with what you were saying, Bernard, in some respects, I think, although there needs to be a kind of high-level discussion, in many respects, actually, how it's been applied in practice is more important. And so, given that we will have a clear process description available, probably it feels better not to be quite so upfront in the guidance, maybe, and to make sure that where our processes, our development processes are described as clearly articulated, and then where there has been any sort of, if you like, conflict or grayness, that is drawn out in the basis for conclusions on that particular topic, if that makes sense. Anthony, you were going to come in and then put your hand down, but you're sort of content with that kind of approach. So everyone okay if we move forward on that basis, Phil?
Perfect, thank you. The second area which we'd like comment on is authority. So we have no authority to determine whether impact should apply to any entity or MPO. We can state, however, that an entity or MPO has to make a specific statement of compliance if it complies with all of the requirements of the authoritative elements of the IMPAG. I think the question for the tag is, are we in agreement that only MPOs that comply with all of the authoritative elements of the IMPAG should be permitted to note that they're compliant? And are there any compliance issues connected then to those MPO specific accounting issues and the sections of the IFRS for SME standard that we will not have reviewed by the time the first version of the IMPAG is released?
Thanks, Phil. Comments on that? Yeah, Jenny.
Thanks. Absolutely agree that only those that have complied with all the guidance should be able to give a statement of full compliance. But I was just wondering, I mean, it's difficult to know, isn't it? Because jurisdictions will hopefully implement it but potentially in different ways. Are we going to allow for any sort of if you've done elements of it, kind of explaining which bits you have done, or was it intended to be a compliance or complete non-compliance? Thanks.
Thanks, Jenny. Good point. Phil, did you want to comment on that?
Just to mute myself. I think that's where this group actually, and the perspective of this group, be really valuable. I'd be wary of a sort of pick and mix approach of someone being able to say, well, we've complied with section 1, 4, 8, and 9 of the IMPAG, because that to a reader or a user might give a sort of false sense that actually there's more compliance than has occurred. But in terms of use of the IMPAG, I can see the counter argument that actually we do want people to use it. And if you can say, well, we're on a journey to full compliance, but in our jurisdiction, we can only do sections 2, 4, 8, and 9. I can also see the benefit of that. So I think I'd throw that back to the tag actually.
So Phil's laid down the challenge there. Anthony, you pick it up first.
Yeah, I was just going to say that any entity can choose, or jurisdiction can choose to use to pick up different parts, but we shouldn't allow them to assert any kind of compliance, so they can make their own decisions around that. And there will be entities that follow different journeys on this, and there might be entities that really like certain parts, and other parts they like their own guidance, which they've developed in their own country. But I don't think we're going to allow entities to. I don't like the idea of asserting compliance with parts. That makes me uncomfortable.
Thanks, Anthony. Labour.
Thanks, Ian. I'll just be brief and say that I completely agree with the point that Anthony has just made. I think if anybody is going to claim compliance, it must be full compliance. Otherwise, you can't make a statement that you part complied.
Great, thanks, Labour. So I think, fairly clear steer on that. And Phil, back to you. Oh, sorry, Chris, come in.
Okay, thank you, Ian, and sorry everyone that I just came in late. I was trying to wrap up with the other meeting. Very important comments that Jenny and other colleagues have just raised there. But again, coming to the point about full compliance about the guidance. Remember initially that one of the challenges we saw on the adoption and implementation of the guidance is technical capabilities and this journey that the NPOs will be having to undertake. So what will happen now if the way maybe I'm just looking at it, of course there are some NPOs that will be having the capacities that will be like by the time the guidance is there, like in 1 year or two, they'll be completely on the line. But these ones that will be coming up progressively, 1 year, 2 years, maybe they are able to adopt some of the sections of the guidance, progressively. How will that be kind of disclosed? And it's something that should actually be encouraged to ensure that people are facilitated and they are moving to their own pace. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I mean it's a sort of familiar situation in terms of first time implementation of standards, and as an example, the IPSASB guidance. The IPSASB has a separate standard on this, which allows a 3-year transitional period in terms of certain key requirements, but also encourages a sort of dry run, if you like, before actually starting formal reporting. And one of the points I think perhaps we should take away is actually what might we as a project provide by way of support guidance on that transition approach. It's certainly, I've heard that brought up on several occasions. So I think we need to give some thought to that in terms of, does that change the actual substantive guidance here, or what do we want to do with that? Tim.
Yeah, I think there seems to be a sort of, in my mind, possibly a theoretical distinction to be made between the technical compliance, and I completely agree with where the tag has gone on this, and almost like the public relations and the communication and the kind of building a movement part of this, and the core humanitarian standard, which is it's not an accounting standard, it's based on ISO principles, but they adopted over their history. There are kind of two ways of displaying your engagement with the standard. One is that you're on a kind of working towards journey, and that needs a very different symbol from a symbol that's saying that you're fully compliant with the standard and has different meanings. So I think that's what we should explore, because we will want to find lots of ways to encourage people onto the stairway to this, but and to communicate that so that it gains wider traction. So we don't want our purity to close that door.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. So I think that's a specific point for the Secretariat to sort of take away and have a think about. But I think in terms of the technical compliance angle, I think there's a fairly clear steer from the group on that. But we do need to address that that, if you like, those pragmatic issues that you just raised there, Tim. So I think that's something that we need to deal with specifically. Okay, Phil, then final question.
Yeah, so the third area is maintenance. So I've used that until the impact is amended for changes to underlying standards, MPOs should not anticipate those changes. So that'll be the first question. And in the absence of guidance in the impact, impact notes that we can use guidance and principles from IFRS, IPSAS, and jurisdictional level guidance, provided that effectively we're following the IFRS for SMEs hierarchy, provided that you first look at requirements in the impact for similar issues and then also look at the concepts and pervasive principles. So the questions for the tag is, does the tag agree that MPO shouldn't be permitted to anticipate changes to any of the underlying frameworks on which the impact is based? And should the hierarchy, which is included in the IFRS for SME standard, of considering requirements and guidance first for similar issues and then the underlying concepts and principles be retained?
Thanks, Phil. So take comments then on either of those questions. Freddie, yeah. Then Jenny.
Thanks. I agree for not to anticipate changes. I think it would be just unwieldy and would disintegrate the whole guidance, I think, very quickly. On the hierarchy, I was actually thinking that I'm not sure whether it's actually preface discussion. I think it's a accounting policy discussion. I don't have anything against it, quite on contrary. And but when I was reading that paragraph 3.6 and the words around they do not conflict, I think it is slightly different what is in SMEs and other hierarchies, which is follow the hierarchy and apply principles of the other standards while we are following the hierarchy. I just want to make sure that we are not adding third step into the hierarchy. That's all.
Okay, thanks for that, Freddie. I think that's very useful. Jenny.
Yeah, thanks. I was just thinking about the first one. So I agree, it gets very complicated if you're trying to sort of do two things at once. And so they shouldn't generally be anticipating changes. So that seems like the right thing. But then I did have I suppose it comes back to the question of how we're expecting this to be implemented, because I suppose if in a jurisdiction there's a general requirement to apply the IFRS for SMEs, and then for NPOs there's an additional requirement to comply with this guidance, then that would leave people in a very difficult situation where one has, you can't, if one has changed and the other hasn't, you potentially can't comply with both at once. But perhaps that isn't going to happen, and the jurisdictions would say you're doing one or the other. And if that's the case, then absolutely they should be not anticipating future changes. Thanks.
Thanks, Jenny. Anybody else wants to come in on this one? Freddie, you back in?
Yeah, thanks. On Jenny's comments, I think that's a very good point. And Australia is not a SMEs jurisdiction, but I think I would then expect those jurisdictions that are already SMEs maybe pick up IPEC and maybe the not-for-profit elements of INGAP, sorry, and kind of link it together because ultimately it will be their decision and disposal what they do with that. But I think ultimate impact, while it's based off IFRS for SMEs, it's gonna stand on its own legs. And I think that's where we are at the maintenance. I think we had this discussion before that it's not gonna be a responsibility of ISB or anyone else. Question is who and how will keep this up to date. But I think at some point it will live its own life.
Yeah. Thanks, Freddie. I think that's a good point. Okay, anything else? Any other points anyone wants to raise? Okay, so I think we're almost ready to break, but Sam, before we break, I saw you wanted to just get everybody to put their cameras on for a minute so that you could actually take a photo. So if those who are not on camera at the moment can
Great, thank you very much. Michelle and Srinivas, are you still there? If you can turn your camera on, that would be great. If not, I'll do 1, 2, 3, go. Oh no, hang on 1 second, let's try it again. 1, 2, 3, smile. Got it, lovely. Thank you, everybody.
Great, okay, thanks everyone. So I think if we take a break at that point in time, and I'm going to suggest that we come back at 10 past, please, and then we'll move into section 1. Okay, so thanks very much, everyone. See you back shortly.
That will be 40 past in India.
First draft of the text for section 1. Non-profit organisations follows a similar approach to the IFRS for SMEs standard. It indicates that NPOs are entities that publish general purpose financial reports for external users, and it describes the broad characteristics of NPOs and indicators that support those broad characteristics. It also discusses the use of the guidance by entities that have public accountability as defined in IFRS, and how the impact could be used by subsidiaries of publicly accountable entities and separate and consolidated financial statements. Again, the basis for conclusions provides a summary of considerations made during its development. So as with the preface, I think the first question to the TAG is, are there any areas that the TAG considers are missing from this first draft of section 1 and the basis for conclusions?
Thanks, Phil. Open for comments on that. Yeah, Jen Chow.
Thanks, Ian. Just one comment on the area on the statement of financial position, statement of movement of net assets, and income and expenses statement. In my understanding, there will be a separate section on those different statements. So I wonder whether at the conceptual level, whether we needed to, specify some, I'm not sure, what kind of content will be included in this with regard to those different statements, because if we look at our ISB's conceptual framework, actually we only set some kind of general requirements on presentation and disclosure, rather than specify what kind of statement we're going to have. So for example, the general requirements on classification, offset, aggregation, disaggregation, this kind of requirements will be included in conceptual framework, rather than to specify mention what kind of statement will be included and what kind of specific requirements for those different individual statements. So I just want to make sure what kind of content will be included in this area. And also, I would like, because currently, if we only mention statement, how about a disclosure requirement as well? Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Jen Chow. I'll go to Jenny and then back to Phil after that.
Thanks. Mine was a fairly minor point, but should we have things like the effective date in this section? Obviously, we might know what that is yet, but we can have a placeholder, or is that going somewhere else? Thanks.
Thanks, Jenny. Phil, back to you on those.
Can I just check? This is for section 1, where we're focusing more on the description of NPOs. So I think in terms of descriptions of the statements and effective dates, I think that's more of a section 2 issue. Can we cover those when we get to that paper?
Okay. That's fine. So we'll hold those till
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Freddie, you're next.
In section 1, I was wondering, while we obviously don't set the exact scope, would it be worth to mention what type, size entities the project had in mind when considering the guidance? And it's a tricky one, and we are dealing with the same method because we don't want to limit the scope, but it's useful to signal what were the entities that this guidance is maybe primarily intended for.
Oh,
yeah, if I can take that, I think that's we have included a paragraph in the basis for conclusions around intended scope. Let me see if I can see BC 1.4, where we are trying to say impact can be used by any MPOs regardless of size or jurisdiction, but that it might not be, it might not meet accountability requirements for those that are small or simple or complex, because they could use potentially cash-based, and more complex organizations may have public accountability in accordance with IFRS, so should follow IFRS, but impact may provide useful guidance for specific transactions. I mean, this is a question for the tag, but for me, that's something that sits better in the basis for conclusions rather than in the main text of the guidance, where it seems to me more of a guidance development discussion rather than this is something that's authoritative in the guidance. But I mean, happy to have other views.
Karen, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, thank you, Ian. Our thinking on this, and I know this has been a vexed question that we've gone round several times so far, and I suspect we've probably got several more iterations to go, was that I think the approach that we're looking to take is to not limit who might use the guidance. And we recognise that it was probably going to be a jurisdictional decision, exactly which entities it would apply to. And defining size is a really difficult thing to do, and will need to be, and it probably is jurisdiction specific. So the approach that we've taken, consistent with what we set out in the other papers, is to use the basis for conclusions to help inform standard setters about what our intention and what our thinking was. And so the approach we've adopted is, as Phil has described there, is to put that thinking in the basis for conclusion rather than in the core text itself. So that's the rationale for the approach that we've adopted, is to allow jurisdictional standard setters to decide how they want to apply and to whom, but to provide a steer in the basis for conclusions about what the project thinking is. So I think there's a question about whether that is sufficient or not, but that's the rationale that we've adopted. Hope that helps.
Thanks, Karen. Go to Jeff G, and then to Daniel after that. Jeff, to you.
I had a quick point. I think that one of the things that you describe in the basic guidance, that the publicly accountable entities should not use NPAG, but then in the basis, maybe this is just a drafting issue, but you don't list under the broad characteristics. You do list that public sector entities should not, aren't part of those broad characteristics, and maybe to include also publicly accountable entities in that list as well. Perhaps it's just a minor issue, but I just thought that since you spent so much time discussing publicly accountable entities as well.
Thanks, Jeff. Phil, back on that, or are you okay?
No, okay, I'll check that. I think for the reason why we explicitly note public sector is because comments that actually a lot of public sector entities could meet the first two broad characteristics. So they are they exist for public benefit and they don't distribute profits and surpluses. So I mean, it'd be whether a publicly accountable entity would meet those broad characteristics or not. But we can check the drafting and see if that would provide additional clarification.
Thanks, Phil. Daniel, to you, and then to Anthony after.
Hi, everybody. I've been always concerned with the term public benefit. I'm not sure of the use of this exactly when we describe an NPO. This could limit, I think, maybe the use of the guide by entities that are not exactly public benefit, but maybe they benefit as a special group of people. And it's the case with some foundation or some association. So when we describe in the section 1, a non-profit organization, we say they have a primary objective of providing goods and or services for public benefit. And the direct process for the public benefit. So I don't know if it could be maybe, I don't know if it could be prejudicial for the use of, for the intended use of the guidance. I don't know if we could say something else in order to say that the guidance will be used also for other institutions that are not intended to distribute profits for private people. I don't know.
I mean, we've been balancing this all the way through, haven't we, in terms of wanting to give an idea as to who the guidance is intended for, i.e. who have we got in mind when we're setting the guidance, but not wanting to rule out anybody else being able to use it. I'm just wondering, Phil, whether there's any sort of potential revisions came to mind just listening to the point that Daniel was making, because I mean, it is, it's fundamental.
Yeah, I mean, we have sort of in a way struggled to articulate this. I mean, in the description, we've changed it to should have all of the following broad characteristics rather than must, which opens things up. Public benefit, when we've discussed it, we have said that it can be quite a small subset of the public. But when you get, which could be as part of a small membership organization, but when you get to that, you do then need to look at the other indicators to see if actually this is the kind of organization that the guidance has been developed for. I mean, we're not saying nobody, you can't use it. We're just saying that the considerations that have been made when standards and the guidance have been developed has been on the basis of a certain type of entity, but the impact may still be of benefit to you if you don't meet all these characteristics, because again, it will be a jurisdiction decision, not something that we can make. So it could be that in one of the additional volumes, potentially the application guidance, we do have that broader discussion of what public benefit might mean in various situations. It's just I've been conscious, I don't want to give examples that then entities use to say I am or I am definitely not this, when that's not really our intention.
I mean, I think, you know, we probably need to make a statement somewhere, you know, it's a sort of that kind of, we're not ruling out its applicability to anybody else type of statement. And that may need to be more in the authoritative text, Phil, but supported by basis for conclusions, because I think the discussion basis for conclusions allows you to provide a lot more of the nuance and the subtleties of the discussion that we've had thus far, and the type of points that Daniel was making, but you know, maybe actually just some sort of upfront statement. But effectively, I think, you know, the back end of your intervention, you kind of actually expressed it quite well. That wouldn't do any harm, you know, maybe even as a footnote or something like that in the, you know, in the core text. because I think we just got to balance it, because you don't want to open it up too far, but equally you don't want to kind of shut it down too much. So if we just work on a combination of those things, so that you've got that indication up front, and a footnote might be quite a good way of doing that, but supplemented by the right discussion and basis for conclusions. And that may, you know, because I think if we get into application guidance, then we're going to start to, you know, so if we can handle it in that way. Anthony.
Thanks, Ian. It may just be a minor point, but paragraph G110, entities that have public accountability is defined in full IFRS may find this guidance useful. It would make more sense to me if that was MPOs that have public accountability. But was that the intention of it?
No.
I think we're in the issue here that if it's whether within the definition of an MPO in IMPAG, an MPO can have public accountability or not. So there may be slight drafting issues where we've said entity where we mean MPO putting forward. But I think it's tricky in this section for us to say it. But I'll check and see if MPO we would be able to use it there.
Yeah, so I'm reading it as if you've got public accountability, this guidance isn't really going to be the right, appropriate for you. Yeah, so thank you.
Yeah, it's how your which is a subset of what type of question, isn't it? Okay, move us on then to the question 2.
Yeah, so we have started to discuss it, so we can continue. So the broad characteristics and indicators in section 1, I think from the last meeting, the most significant change has been around public sector and government entities, and the change in the characteristic there. And we've also amended some of the indicators on the back of discussion at the PAG to take into consideration entities like co-ops and those providing benefits through membership schemes. So if the TAG have any views on any further changes to the broad characteristics or indicators that need to be made, and whether there might be additional guidance needed in this area beyond the core text and the basis for conclusions.
Thanks, Phil. Catherine, to you first.
Sure. So I'm actually struggling a little bit with the interaction between sort of the core criteria that we have and the indicators. And I just think in practice, it's not really clear sort of how you interact between those two, because we're quite clear that there's criteria that need to be met. And then you sort of layer these indicators on top, and they're not necessarily linked to sort of determining if any particular criteria are met. So I don't know whether there'd be sort of more clarity if you link some of those indicators to the specific criteria. It might be something that sort of working through what examples or some application guidance might be helpful to kind of illustrate how that's actually going to work. Because when I sort of apply it in practice, you know, if I think of an example where you've gone through the criteria and you're not really sure, I struggle with a little bit in terms of how that interaction works.
Thanks, Catherine. I'll go to Daniel next and then back to you, Phil.
Thank you again. I have a concern about the indicators, especially the first one, because it says absence of rights to financial returns and requirement to transfer residual net assets upon dissolution. I think a lot of NPOs have a clause to indicate that at the time of dissolution, they transfer the net assets to other not-for-profit organization. So I think it could be a little confusing. It would be good to clarify this.
Thanks, Daniel, and I saw support for that. Phil.
If I answer Daniel immediately, it is meant to be. It's probably how I've written this, but it is meant to be that you should have a requirement to transfer. So it's sort of two clauses. So an absence of rights to financial returns, stop, and a requirement of the entity to transfer residual net assets upon dissolution to a similar entity. So it should cover, I think, hopefully that point, Daniel. I'll rewrite it so that it's clearer, because we've sort of merged two things together there, which actually have fairly different meanings. And on Catherine's point, the indicators, that it's primarily around the sort of public benefit objective characteristic. So when we've attempted to apply these to specific examples, the main questions that's come back is I'm a cooperative or I'm a membership organization. I have a fairly small group of people that benefits providing for. Is this for me or not? So in that case, we can then go to the indicators and say, okay, let's look at these and see actually if these are also there. So is it the case that when this entity is wound up, actually all of the benefits go back to the members, or is it the case that actually it's more of a receipt of financial returns through discounted goods and services going strictly just to those members, which might indicate actually this isn't really a public benefit organization, it's a private benefit organization just structured in a different way. But if it's not clear that you're meant to do the characteristics first, and then if they don't provide that clarity, move to the indicators, and if we need to tie them specifically better to individual characteristics, we can look at that.
I mean, that, you know, listening to Catherine's original explanation, it does, or original concern, it does seem to me that actually if we can be clearer so that you tie those to the characteristic, and then there's some further explanation in application guidance, that would be quite a neat way of doing it, so that it helps you with that thought process in terms of how you apply the characteristics, what they mean in practice. And so it sort of says, well, you know, in thinking about it, think about this, and you know. So I think if we can help people in that way, that would be a good idea. Yeah, Jeff.
I was just going to say, we can help, we can give some examples, but this is a very difficult judgment area, this area of like trade associations versus membership organizations versus clubs. It is not an easy line to make that judgment as to whether it should be within this guidance or not. So I'm just saying it, I'm not sure how clear we can really make it. It's going to be a judgment call.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that, Jeff. I mean, it does come back to the kind of breadth of organizations that might potentially apply it, but that might mean that at least we give some, you know, as you say, a couple of examples without giving too many, so that at least you get the idea of the different types of organizations and how it might work. But I think, you know, with the examples, implementation examples is always difficult. People always want more. So again, if we can tie it to the principles, I think that, but whilst illustrating the breadth, that would be helpful. Anthony.
Oh, just briefly, we've tackled this issue in New Zealand, and it's causes long discussions. And whatever you do, you can never get rid of the grey. But we've got a number of examples which we're happy to forward through.
That'd be great. Thanks, Anthony.
Yeah. No, I've seen those, Anthony. They are very useful because your examples are quite nuanced in that it says, well, if you're this way, then this might apply. But actually, if you're this way, then that might apply. So they are handy. So I did draft a few examples. I think the issue is whether we want to provide those within the impact text, as it were, or the guidance, or that's something that it's more of a sort of broader education piece when discussion with individual jurisdictions, because I think on a jurisdictional level, the types of organizations may differ quite significantly. And I'm just conscious, I don't want to make this a sort of types of organizations and examples that I think are appropriate, but it's might just be very much a sort of British or European context and not have that nuance and colour that we'd want to show.
So I think, Phil, it goes back to the sort of earlier discussion about the fact that it's how we use the different layers of guidance. And if you can see that clear line through that says, here's the characteristic, here are the indicators, and this is the sort of way you would think about those, that's application guidance. And then you can provide the non-authoritative examples, you know, and there may be a bridge as well through implementation guidance. So, you know, it's thinking about that process so that it kind of gradually unpacks the issue, keeping, if we can, to the principle level. So I think that's where, have a look at the examples that Anthony was referring to, that Jeff was referring to, and let's try and draw the print, get a sense of the richness of the sector, but also the principles we're trying to apply and join them in that way. Jenny.
Yeah, thanks. Just sort of thinking on from that, and that, you know, it can be a difficult judgment. I can't remember whether we've talked about this before, and it wouldn't be something for section 1, but did we have any thought of requiring entities to sort of confirm or disclose that they do feel they meet the criteria of being an MPO in the way that we've described it here? And then, of course, if that was disclosed, then things like the general disclosure requirement around disclosure of significant judgments, you know, might lead to them providing some information for those difficult cases, you know, providing some analysis of why it was more appropriate than whatever the alternatives were. But I can't remember whether we talked about it before or not, I'm afraid, sorry.
Oh.
I don't think we have. We've said that people can't state compliance if they say, we'll get to this in a second, if they're publicly accountable as defined by full IFRS, but we haven't said that entities must or should say that actually I do meet all of these broad characteristics, because I think the way we've structured this is these broad characteristics and indicators help us think of the type of entities and accounting issues they might face when we're developing the guidance, but we're not then saying, if you are this type of entity, you must apply it, because that's for the jurisdiction to determine. So I think if we were to say, you have to state that you are in compliance with section 1, that would be us riding over a jurisdiction determination. And it would probably be more for the jurisdiction to decide, is it appropriate for us as a jurisdiction to apply the impact to the types of entities that we are going to legally say or regulatory say have to apply it.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thanks, Phil. So move us on then.
So yeah, so we've just touched on it now. So we have a prohibition from statement of compliance within for entities that are publicly accountable, as they should be in a context using full IFRS. It's just whether the tag consider that they're content with that prohibition on the face of the impact effectively.
I mean, it's really whether it's the interface between the two, the characteristics and the public definition of publicly accountable, isn't it? Catherine, on that.
I'm sort of struggling with this one a little bit, and particularly because I feel like there's a bit of a disconnect by saying that we are going to leave it up to the jurisdictions to determine who should apply. We are sort of explicitly certain subset. So what happens in that case if a jurisdiction deems it appropriate for some of those entities that might be publicly accountable, but then they can't assert compliance with the standards? You know, what are the flow-on impacts? And this might even be a PEG question in terms of audit requirements, and how do you do an audit when you're not allowed to state compliance with a framework? So I struggle with this one a little bit, and I don't know whether, do we really need to say that? or is that something that we can leave up to the jurisdictions in determining where they think applicability should be?
Thanks, Catherine. I think that's helpful to think it through in those terms. I'll take comments from Anthony and Jeff before going back to Phil.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Just coming in that Catherine's comments make a lot of sense. So maybe we soften that paragraph rather than a firm prohibition.
Thanks, Anthony. Jeff, and then Tim.
Yeah, I struggle with that a little too. I think some of it comes down to making sure we have the wording and the examples and whatever right about public accountability in a in a not-for-profit context as opposed to broad business type context, and that goes to one of the comments that was made earlier. But I was just sort of curious here, shouldn't we be somewhat taking the same approach or similar approach to what the ISB takes here with IFRS for SMEs? Should we really be taking a different approach in terms of, I mean, if they're firm about it, shouldn't we be firm about it, for example? Again, once we get public accountability right in terms of the wording.
So I'll just take comments then from Tim and Chris, and then I'll go back to you, Phil, at that stage.
I was just thinking how we're trying, we've been struggling with this to describe who's it for. And we're building this video at the moment, which is taking us a long time, partly because of the complexity of doing this in the right way. But it strikes me that what we're trying to achieve is that we're recognizing that large, complex nonprofits might need other forms of guidance in order to fulfill all of their needs. Whereas, and I think it's probably, whereas part of the reason why we want to say this is because the IFRS for SMEs element of this is not applicable to these bigger entities. It's not, I would have thought that very few, it's hard to hazard, very few of what we're saying about the non-profit specific requirements are likely to be invalid. It's just that there's going to be other areas of guidance that are needed. So somehow if we can achieve that, getting that expressed in this section, I think it might help.
Thanks, Tim. Chris, and then back to you, Phil.
Thank you, Ian. I also struggled a bit to understand this G110 about the public accountability in regard to IFRS. Maybe just I'd like some understanding, but when it comes to public accountability in regard to IFRS, I would maybe assume some examples that we would have is maybe publicly listed entities because they have public funds. But again, there's another issue I've also been thinking about. Some of the NPOs in this region, particularly in Rwanda, you find that because there is no such a guidance such as impact, they try to relate on which framework to use. You find some of them using IFRS, but again, if you're looking at the disclosure requirements, they are not really compliant with IFRS, and again, you'd understand the reason as to why. So now, putting now this prohibition of making a statement that not compliant with impact, I'm just assuming a situation whereby maybe a certain NPO now says, now I have a guidance, we need to move now from, say, IFRS for SME or IPSAS standard, whatever standard framework that we're using, now we need to move to impact. But again, they will maybe trying to be making some comparison. Okay, this is how we've been reporting under this standard, this framework, and now we're trying to move to impact. So at that moment, whereby maybe they do, I don't want to call it a full transition, but in terms of the comparison, they may think like they are still compliant with our impact. So anyway, I don't know what question to, I don't know exactly what question to ask, but anyway, there will be those scenarios, and I think more guidance may be needed. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Phil, I'll just go back to you briefly, and then I'll take comments from Jeff and Catherine.
Yeah, so the reason for its inclusion is the IFRS for SME standard is very clear that if an entity is publicly accountable, even if it is required by law or regulation in its jurisdiction to apply IFRS for SMEs, it can't say its financial statements conform to the IFRS for SME standard. I mean, our view is that if an entity has public accountability, IMPAG is not going to meet the accountability and decision-making needs of its users, because we are not covering the areas that they need, and the IFRS for SME standard itself says that it is insufficient. So I think we wanted to be clear in here, given it's in the IFRS for SME standard, that we need to be upfront about it as well. And looking at how we've approached our, how we've edited the IFRS for SME standard, if there is an NPO specific reason, if there is no NPO specific reason to delete it, we'll keep it in. Here, I think there is an NPO specific reason to keep it in and make a slight amendment to say, look, if you're publicly accountable, IMPAG's not going to meet your user needs, which is why we've looked to retain it. It maybe we need to finesse the language a little, but I think we do need to be clear that if you are publicly accountable, unfortunately at the moment, IMPAG's not going to be right for your users.
Thanks, Phil. I'll take comments from Catherine and Jenny.
Yeah, I think just to follow up on this, I think I understand sort of the concerns with removing it. I think softening the language is probably the right approach. And the reason why I think we are different from IFRS for SMEs here, because what the IASB is trying to do is tell you to use full IFRS if you don't meet IFRS for SMEs. Because we don't have something else to point people to, it's really challenging to say, well, you can't use this, so you have nothing. So I like the idea of softening the language around sort of, and not even to say that if you're publicly accountability, probably, you know, I don't even know if we have to say so far as you will not meet this will not meet your users' needs, but you should, you know, give serious consideration to whether this would be sufficient for the needs of your users or something along those lines. So it leaves a judgment call there and without ruling it out entirely.
Thanks, Catherine. That sounds to me you know, quite an elegant way forward, as you say, bearing in mind that we don't have a full set of standards for you know, NPOs. Jenny.
Thanks. I was just thinking, it's a slightly different point, but if it's a sort of related point to the one we discussed earlier around you can only state full compliance if you've complied with everything, and you know, if you're on a journey or whatever, and so you've just done elements, you can't say you've complied. And this is a slightly different angle to that, but one where it is meeting some of your, it's helpful in some regards, but in other regards you need something more, and therefore again you're not likely to be able to comply with every aspect because there will be additional things. So yeah, I just wondered if it was a different part of that, a different example of applying parts of the guidance. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, there's a difference, isn't there, Jenny, between, you know, actually I'm applying IMPAG, I am publicly accountable, sorry, I am a publicly accountable NPO, and I'm using IMPAG, and then, you know, adding anything else in. So
yeah,
in that case, I could comply with IMPAG, but I've added stuff in. As to, I've done IMPAG minus because I happen to have liked it.
Yes, yeah.
So
different situations, but
trying to avoid the cherry picking aspect, which was the earlier discussion. But I think Catherine quite elegantly described the sort of situation, and I think the principal rationale for being different in this case to IFRS for SMEs, precisely because of not having a complete full set of standards as we do with IFRS. And I think that's the rationale for actually softening in this case. So I think, you know, if you can get that in, Phil, you know, but picking up on the point as well in terms of compliance and so on, that feels like a sort of principled place to land on this. Okay. Good. So anything else then on section 1? Phil?
The final question was just any key points of principle from the drafting, but I think we've probably covered most. And looking at the clock and the amount in section 2, we might need to saunter on to the next paper.
Yeah, Catherine, you just wanted to make a final point before we move on.
Yeah, just very quickly. In the basis for conclusions, with respect to the voluntary funding indicator, in the basis for conclusions, we talk about how this has been expanded to cover sort of grant giving bodies and foundations and those types of things. I just don't see that necessarily reflected in the text of the drafting. So maybe take a look at that just because the basis does say it's expanded, but when I read it, I don't get the essence that that's being captured.
I think I've just deleted my text, but I think we changed it to from receipt of voluntary funding to receipt and provision, but I'll make sure that has been included.
It looks like maybe that didn't get through in the draft that we have.
Okay.
I'm still just seeing receipt.
Okay.
Good.
So if you that's good. Okay, so as you say, Phil, moving then into section 2, where we have many issues to discuss.
Yes.
Let's started on that.
So section 2 provides the concepts and pervasive principles of the IMPAG with a basis for conclusions providing a summary of considerations that have been made during its development. As with the other 2 papers, and this might get to some of the points that were raised in section 1, are there any areas that the TAG considers missing from this section and the basis for conclusions? Subject to, I think, a sort of broader point that the timing of the IFRS for SMEs review and the fact that we've had to use a bit of the updated ISB conceptual framework has caused some sort of issues for us in what we are including in this section. So it's been difficult to draft because we're trying to anticipate changes which may or may not be made while keeping brief. So just a sort of generic overview. If there are significant sections people think are missing, that's my mea culpa.
Thanks, Phil. And I think this is where obviously Jen Chow made the point about sort of presentation and primary statements. So log that for here. Karen, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, no, just to expand on what Phil was saying. Obviously, we are writing in parallel with each other, and so we haven't had the benefit of seeing what's going to be in the exposure draft of the revised IFRS for SMEs. So the drafting that we have done is based on the kind of updates that we might anticipate to have in there based on changes to the conceptual framework that have happened since the last update to IFRS for SMEs. So there is kind of some revisions to content as a result of that, but it may be that in the updates that are made, there are further changes to be made. I think there will be a question that we come to, and I'm stealing Phil's thunder here a bit, is about how much is in the core guidance and how much is in application guidance, recognizing this is a really important section of the document, but it's also quite a long one as well. So I think we probably ought to look at it at first principles in terms of what are the kinds of things that we would expect to see in a concepts and pervasive principles section for non-profit organizations, and focus on that. And then when we get to see some sort of early drafting of the updates that ISB are making, we can then look to tie those 2 together. But we need to start somewhere. So this is where we've started from. Hope that helps.
Thanks, Karen. And just to say at this stage to record our thanks to colleagues at ISB for really being very supportive and also as open as possible within the constraints of their discussions in terms of giving us the insight into their work. Really appreciate that. And it's particularly an issue for this phase, this CD, obviously, bearing in mind the way your timetable. Okay, so back to that opening couple of questions from a question from Phil. Any particular additional thoughts at that point? Okay, so move us on then, Phil. Oh, Jenny.
Sorry, I was a bit late there. The thing I wanted to just mention was the bit at the back, the new bit on presentation, which obviously is really important. But I suppose I was wondering whether this was more talking about general communication principles, which is really important and relevant, rather than concepts underlying the financial statements themselves, and therefore whether this section was the right place for it, or whether it needed to be sort of separated slightly and covered in a, yeah, an additional section or something. That was all. Thanks.
Thanks, Jenny. I mean, I think that's one for you to take away, really, Phil, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's, I mean, it is included at the end of the, if I got this right, the IPSAS-B conceptual framework, but it is a significantly longer section than what we've included here. So it's whether we include it here and then, as Karen just mentioned, then put the bulk of it, say, in application guidance, discussing broader presentation, whether it belongs here at all. As it stands, my personal view is probably we're not saying enough to make it for it to be super relevant, but if we can use it as an anchor to then tie through to other guidance, I think it is useful.
So, I mean, in a sense, actually, back to that last point then, Phil, the answer to this is going to depend on, well, how does this evolve in practice, doesn't it? And, I mean, just in terms of the IPSAS-B conceptual framework, I mean, the presentation chapter actually is based on 3 principles, sort of what, where, how, really. And so there may be a kind of, a compromise here in terms of just, if you like, articulating that and being brief here. And then, you can add back if you need to, or as things develop. Karen.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think Jenny could have been a fly on the wall in some of the conversations that we've had about whether it belongs in this section or whether it should be in a section on its own. In this draft, we included it to basically expose that question. So you've done that really well for us. So I think it's probably an area of developmental thinking. And if TAG members, in the light of this conversation, have got any strong views on it, then please do email us after this meeting to let us know your thoughts on it. That would be incredibly helpful.
Thanks, Karen. Okay, so move on to the next question then, Phil. Question 2.
From mute, Phil.
Sorry, there we go. I was trying to keep the dog barking from coming through. Question 2. So we have used the ISB and IPSAS-B's conceptual frameworks, partly because we're expecting revisions to the IFRS Section 2 based on the updated ISB conceptual framework, but also because we do think that there are parts of the IPSAS-B conceptual framework that are appropriate in the MPO context. And we'll get onto that, but things like service potential, which is explicitly mentioned. So I think the question for the TAG at this point is a general one of, do the TAG think it is appropriate to use these conceptual frameworks, notwithstanding that the IFRS for SME's framework may be updated to better reflect the IASB's conceptual framework?
Okay, comments? ready.
Thanks, Ian. I had a question, I think, on, for example, faithful representation, where it seemed to me more IPSASB rather than ISB. I wasn't sure. I absolutely acknowledge that in some parts, when we'll get to it, service potential, etc., IPSASB should come in. We'll talk about value in use. But that one, for example, it wasn't clear to me and didn't see anything that would be not appropriate, but it wasn't clear at which point we switch to IPSASB, at which point we don't. But maybe just a process point rather than anything else.
That specifically, it was because the IPSASB conceptual framework is a lot more concise. There wasn't any underlying conceptual issue. It's just in the ISB conceptual framework, to get to the point we needed to make, it was about 3.5, 4 pages of text. Whereas in the IPSASB, it had a very nice short summary, and then there was the text behind it, which then kind of links into our next question on what goes here and what goes in the sort of background information.
Cool. Thanks.
Jenny.
Yeah, thanks. It's just a question, actually, because I think, for us reading this, it's quite nice to have the color coding so that we can see what the source of the material was, and then we can see how the different things have fed in. And I just wondered whether that was something you were planning to carry forward into the public exposure draft, not into the final guidance, but into the exposure draft to help respondents understand. And I think this probably goes back to some comments made earlier about just how the framework's been applied in putting it all together. But yeah, so just a question. Thanks.
I mean, Karen, on that, I mean, I could envisage a situation where, for example, I mean, IPSASB has done, kind of provided 2 documents side by side, so that the one that's being sought, comments on is the unmarked up version. But for information, the marked up version is provided to give, to give people that sort of insight. I don't know whether you've had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I think that people have asked through some of our outreach about being able to see the changes that are there. So for those that are familiar with it, that can be quite useful. For others, it's going to be the first time that they've looked at it, and so less relevant for them. So I think a bit like Ian has said, I think we'll be looking to have both available. We are drafting it that way, so we will have it accessible to us. If we get to a point where that becomes not feasible, we might have to review that approach, but certainly in principle, I think that's something we can do.
So going back to the point then, so I mean, in developing the guidance, then we've got a clear hierarchy, and obviously, to a great extent, that's rooted in the ISB's hierarchy, conceptual framework. Mm-hmm. And when you look at the, SASB has its own conceptual framework, but there are overlaps. Even, if you look at qualitative characteristics, it's mm-hmm. expressed the same. And I wonder whether, in this case, what you were expressing here was a pragmatic consideration, such that the way it's expressed in the IPSASB conceptual framework happens to be more concise and better oriented. And I wonder whether, when we're looking at the frameworks, we don't need to be quite as black and white as we are when we use the standards. Clearly, I think we would need to explain where the material has come from, and if we've used IPSASB material over IFRS in a certain situation, whether that's pragmatic or conceptual. But I wonder whether the group are content with that slightly fuzzier approach, if that's the word, or more pragmatic approach, if you know, it's framework rather than standards level material.
Yeah, I mean, at the moment we've got, for this in particular, there's sort of 3 issues. One, we're having to use particularly ISB's conceptual framework because the IFRS for SME standard hasn't yet been updated. So that a lot of that should potentially fall away. It's then, is it then, even when that IFRS for SME's section 2 has been updated, is it appropriate to use other conceptual frameworks? So a more theoretical discussion. Then do we have a strict hierarchy, which I think we do? And then if we move away from that hierarchy, should we only move away for technical reasons, or can we move away just because, say, the IPSASB is more concise and easier for the users? So there's multiple discussion points, I think, because a lot of the feedback on the consultation paper was, how are you going to make this conceptually coherent? 1, for MPOs, and 2, if you are using lots of different sets of standards. So I'm just conscious that we need to get good buy-in from this group on the approach.
Further comments? I mean, you know, certainly one of the things that may well be useful to reproduce at some stage, Phil, from an informational point of view, is the comparison table between the conceptual frameworks, the IPSASB and the ISB's framework that we had in the consultation paper, because again, that shows you the similarities and the differences there, and that would help you with the you know, the sort of articulation in terms of the issue. I mean, probably the rebuttable presumption is that we're following the approach that, you know, of the hierarchy. You know, unless in a certain case it's the same approach, but it's expressed in a more MPO friendly way, if you draw on the IPSASB literature. Does that make sense? Okay. So content to move forward on that basis, Phil?
Yeah, perfect. So on to the third question. So we've looked to ensure that the core guidance remains concise. So only high-level concepts and principles have been included, with the expectation that additional detail will be included in the authoritative application guidance. The question is, does the TAG agree with this approach, or would they expect to see actually more within the core guidance text itself?
Open for comments. I mean, I suspect some of this comes back to actually being clear about the way in which we're sourcing the guidance in the first place. And again, is it the same as in IFRS for SMEs, or is it different? If it's elaboration, drawing on other sources, then that could go in application guidance, it seems to me. But if there's a difference in a principle or approach for the MPO sector, then that would, I think, need to be in the core, not with appropriate explanation. Anthony, Freddie.
Sorry, not sure how I managed to get my hand to go up. No comment at the moment.
Okay. So, Freddie.
Yeah, so I think it goes back to that. I think the authoritative guidance does have to be present along with the core guidance, and they shouldn't be in conflict. I do understand as an authority guidance as a further explanation or elaboration on the core guidance, and it's almost like a practical expedient in terms of user friendliness of the document or the guide. But to be honest, I'm actually looking at them as as one object, really. And in many cases, I suspect, especially in the core principles, judgmental areas, users of impact will look at the core guidance and then immediately will go into the authoritative guidance to actually see, okay, what does it really mean?
Yeah, I think that's right. And actually that's what we want them to do, really.
Yeah, so I think with that, I think we could be succinct at that core guidance, or there is a bit of space to put stuff into authoritative guidance, because you know, it's not that it's a second order of importance or anything like that. Quite on contrary.
I mean, I think, you know, it comes back to that overarching discussion we had at the beginning, that if we've got different levels, then we need to be very clear about why something sits in application guidance rather than core text, because both will be authoritative. And, you know, it seems to me that, you know, if you have a kind of clear principle that you're going to bring over what's in IFRS, the chapter in IFRS for SMEs, and then amend as necessary for the sector. Now that does give you a different answer to actually then we can edit what's in IFRS for SMEs because it's additional explanation. So I think we've got to be quite explicit about why we're doing one or the other, but there's a reason, rather than it's just a matter of taste. That makes sense, because clearly there is an accountability. There's also a usability if somebody's looking at this and saying, well, how does it differentiate from what's different from IFRS for SMEs? That makes sense. Phil, Freddie, are you still in, or are you? Okay. Phil, back to you.
Excellent. So if we could move on now to more of the detailed content. So users of general purpose financial reports, we've been over this a number of times in recent meetings, particularly discussion about whether we include internal users and the sort of the position of donors. I think our question is the tag happy, or do they have any further comments on how users of MP or GPFRs have been articulated here? And is the position of groups such as donors, who may sometimes be primary users and may not, well articulated in the text?
Jeff.
I think that part of this section, that part of the concepts and pervasive principles is well articulated. Where I had a little more difficulty is, I guess it's the articulation between what's in information needs of users for accountability and decision making, and then what's then said information provided by GPFRs to meet the needs of users. If you read the first section there, it almost seems like decision making, economic decision making, sort of a byproduct, or the information for that is a byproduct of the information that's provided for accountability. So all the stress is on accountability, and if it happens to provide some information for economic decision making by grantors, lenders, and so forth doing their due diligence, fine, but that's not the primary thrust here. Then when you read on, you then get into needing to provide information about financial performance and so on. So I think it's all there ultimately, but it's just needs to be reworked a little bit. I think if you read it through, it almost downplays economic decision making, which is really an important part of the purpose of general purpose financial statements or financial reports.
And what you've articulated there kind of goes back into the whole, what's the objectives of financial statements and the stewardship accountability debate that ISB had, for example.
Yeah.
And they kind of had one objective, whereas IPSASB had both in terms of decision making and accountability.
Yeah, I think it's just a matter of relatively equal emphasis as opposed to downplaying economic decision making.
And I was going to say, I mean, there's some nuances then in terms of how the ISB developed its objective in the 2018 framework, but I'm not sure that's quite as explicit as the dual purpose in the IPSASB framework. And the idea there was that played up accountability, that you still had decision making, but it played up accountability because of usage of public funds. And I suspect actually we should be clear that would be appropriate here, that you want to explicitly and be clear about that.
Just on that, the feedback from the consultation paper was that we hadn't focused on accountability enough, and there was too much decision making. So if we've gone too far the other way, I can just dial it back a little, and hopefully we'll get to the right result.
That sounds like that might be where we go. Okay, so Anthony, then Freddie, then Ted.
Thanks again, and apologies if I missed an earlier discussion on this. But when I was reading this, I was looking for who are the users of IPOs, and I found that in the BCs, being the service users, the resource providers, the regulators, and the broader society. So is that idea in the BC, should that be in the context? Or am I missing an earlier discussion? Because I found that really very useful. What was in the BC?
I think you're right, actually, that it probably would make sense that actually is in the core text, because it's important context. So thanks for that comment. So then I've got Freddie, then Tim.
Actually, on the users and the regulators, and I would have to check, but I'm not sure whether ISB CF actually specifically rule them out, because they would have access to through other means. And in not-for-profit space here, we are now tackling that question that whether indeed in not-for-profit space, they are super user. So parking that, I don't have the answer, but just flagging that. On the accountability and economic decision-making, I think in our conceptual framework, if my notes are correct, I'm not sure whether it's our own or ISB's, we have a resource allocation decisions, and then linking them, that this broad term then includes accountability when we are talking about specifically NFPs. So we kind of ultimately said, well, economic decisions will ultimately include accountability. However, that conceptual framework avoided using economic decision. I think used the resource allocation, which I think talks maybe more towards the NFP, not-for-profit world.
Thanks, Freddie.
Thank you.
Do you want me to go, Ian?
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought I hadn't seen you express it in quite these ways, and I thought it was very elegant. You're saying that if a user has got power to request other information, that doesn't make them the primary user. I thought that was good. I think we should, I'm not sure, I don't think we've socialized that with either the PAG or the donor reference group. It would be good to get that section in front of them and get everybody on the same page on that, because I thought that was a different way of approaching it from how we've approached it before. It was elegantly done. The only concern I had and the thought was, at the moment, there are still many jurisdictions, and I'm interested what people from different jurisdictions knowledge of this, that there's no public repository for non-profit accounts. So some of the kind of thrust of your argument is that it's playing this really important accountability role to general users, but if there's no requirement for these accounts to be published or even made available on websites, then actually you could be complying with this but not achieving that accountability aim. So I don't know how we deal with that.
I mean, some of it, you're right, Tim, but some of it is about actually just, you know, how obvious, how easily available, you know, the financial statement should be. I don't know whether we want to get too far into that, because it's quite a big issue of itself. Phil, any thoughts on that?
That to me is a jurisdictional issue. Well, we could put something in about these will be met if the statements are published widely or are freely available to all users, and we could actually then link that back to the sort of societal accountability issue that we raised in the consultation paper. I'm just conscious that I don't want to put in that, and to meet this you must publish these on your website or have them freely available to any user who comes to your offices.
That I think that kind of formulation that you gave us, Phil, I think would work, and I saw thumbs up to that. Okay, I'm conscious of time. I'm going to move us on then into the question 5. I think you raised that point about, do we bring over the distinction between fundamental and enhancing qualitative characteristics? Any objections then to to bringing that in? Okay, good. So let's move on then to the question about the elements, where Phil is proposing bringing in the elements from the ISB's framework.
Yeah, so this is probably the area that we need the most input on, because we've the two issues: one, bringing in those elements, and two, the changes that we've made to equity to sort of redefine it as net assets and include funds, and also then add equity as a subset. So I think the first one is, are we happy with the elements from ISB being adopted? And then two, are we happy with the incorporation of equity into this new broader element, which we've defined as net assets?
So let's pick up the first one, and then move into the question around equity. Jeff.
I have, I guess, a couple of issues with the elements, and I'll start with equity, but I also have an issue with calling a realized loss an expense, but I can get to that some other time maybe. But on equity, I've always viewed equity as synonymous with net assets. It's a little jarring to see equity without some sort of qualifier in front of it being a subset of net assets. And I'd be curious, I'm not sure it's really clear here, what kind of examples do you have in mind here that would need a specific call out within net assets as equity? Couldn't tell.
So I'll take Daniel next, and then Phil, over to you.
Thank you. I don't know if it will be important to include some kind of criteria to differentiate a transaction that directly affects net assets from one that affects income. This has, I think, a significant effects on the evaluation of the management of the NPO. I don't know.
I mean, it's tricky, certainly when Sainsbury went around this in terms of its framework, it tried to avoid actually pinning any of the elements to either performance or the balance sheets, because of the sort of issue that you were just articulating there, Daniel. Now, so there's an implication, but not an explicit attribution, if you like. I mean, it seems to make sense to bring the broad elements definitions over, but then on the equity point, you know, perhaps Phil, you can pick that one up. I mean, certainly, I know when you know, Karen and I had a discussion about this the other day, and I made pretty much the same comment that Jeff has just made. Phil, do you want to just pick that one up about equity versus net assets?
Yeah, so I think equity from a financial accounting perspective, equity. I think the issue we've had is equity. It's quite a jarring. Discussing not-for-profits, it seemed quite jarring because equity almost became then synonymous in most people's minds with shares and shareholdings. So what we've tried to do is say, okay, so equity in that sense might exist, but that's only things that are subject to equity claims. And we don't actually think this is going to be that common for the kinds of NPOs that this guidance is being designed for. But we wanted to make that distinction rather than say, okay, equity is just effectively net assets and it might include funds or it might include reserves related to valuation movements. We were trying to really show that actually, for the way that most people understand this who aren't strict sort of financial accountants, equity is just that very small subset of things that effectively are sort of like almost like ownership and shareholders funds that will come back to them, and they will definitely be subject to that sort of claim. It's just quite hard to articulate that in 2 or 3 small paragraphs, and it might not have come across that well.
Jeff, you want to come back on that?
Yeah, just a little bit. I mean, I wonder if it's worth making this distinction. I think you may be creating more confusion by doing that. If you do it, I think you need to say something more specific than equity. Some I don't know if you want to say owner's equity, or I mean, that even is kind of weird because we talk. I'm not sure exactly what it is. I guess I'd have to even hear what some of the examples are really, where you'd have the need to distinguish that from other net assets.
I mean, that perhaps comes back into the discussion about restricted, unrestricted, actually, Jeff.
Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe in terms of the way forward, that we should say, at this stage, we're minded to go with net assets. I mean, I think, Phil, in terms of drafting, maybe have a look at some of the discussion in the IPSASB conceptual framework, because I think we acknowledge there might be some cases where there was equity in an organisation using IPSAS, but essentially what we were talking about there was net assets, so that just get that sense into it that the focus is primarily for the sector on net assets.
So I think that was there's I think the IPSASB was maybe ownership contributions, which I'd originally had in and then I'd taken out because we wanted, I think from a sort of accountability and user perspective, we wanted to show that, okay, there's net assets of equity, but within that there may be unrestricted funds that can be used for any of the purposes. There may be restricted funds, which are quite a special subset in the NPO sector. There may be, depending on the accounting policies, there may be revaluation reserves that actually are a third subset, which aren't the same as unrestricted and restricted funds. So it's trying to get all of those with also a view to how those will then be presented in the various statements.
But I think what we're talking about here is how you address the subcategorization of net assets on view, and certainly restricted, unrestricted is important. It's probably better to get the emphasis on that. Sam, you wanted to come in on this?
Yeah, thank you. I just want to recall when I first saw my first set of accounts that referred to this part of the balance sheet as net assets. I was already a qualified accountant with 2 years post-qualification experience, and I'd been auditing charity accounts the first time I saw it, and I was utterly floored. I remember being so confused. Net assets is assets minus liabilities. It's just a mathematical thing. And so I don't have a great alternative to offer, but I just want to sort of shout out, I'm not really keen on the term net assets. And I mean,
I think you know, Sam, you've just articulated the kind of, is it just actually the, you know, the arithmetic, you know, results of assets less liabilities, and in some respects maybe it actually is, because it's not actually you know, something intrinsically different like equity, but you know, not everything is unrestricted. So, you know, I think it probably is a sector thing, and we just need to actually delve a bit further into that. But I'm not hearing support for we need equity as a separate element here. Jenny, did you want to comment? Okay. So I'm sort of mindful of time here, that we're now at the end of the 3-hour session. I mean, I think, you know, in summing up, therefore, you know, we're, you know, tentatively looking at net assets. I think we need to do a bit further work about this restricted, unrestricted point. Phil, I'm not sure we can kind of go further than that today. Is that going to?
No, I think if for the remaining questions that, well, on the net assets point, I mean, we've been through a lot of drafting on this. Originally, it was funds and reserves. Is that, and it takes equity out, or is this more of a, people actually do think we should have equity in and then provide a non-profit explanation below that as the element?
Well, I think we're saying not equity as an element. I think, you know, the question is whether it is actually, you know, I mean, net assets is essentially, you know, assets less liabilities. The question is what you do with funds stroke reserves, you know, because actually that you can, you know, to an extent that picks up what you just said in terms of revaluations. There are certain things that are different within that, you know, but it comes into what are the specific things that are important, both from a decision-making and an accountability point of view. You know, so, you know, perhaps you do need to explore funds and reserves and how that would actually work, bearing in mind the particularities of the sector. I've got hands up now from Bill and from Anthony on that. So take Bill first and then Anthony.
I was just thinking, in our Mexican standards, we do have a local standard that complements our full standards, the equivalent of IAS1. And we've decided it probably, but it's in Spanish, but translated would be just patrimony. And have we considered that as, is that somehow conflict with what's been said? I'm not sure that it does. I think that might be an alternative.
Thanks, Bill. Anthony?
Just another alternative we use in New Zealand. It depends if it rings true internationally, but accumulated funds is what we use. Just another idea.
Yeah. Tim? I mean, I think, you know, probably we need to collect terms, and it may be that actually the way we, you know, let's do that additional piece of work in terms of the various distinctions within those funds, accumulated funds, or however we determine it. And then we may need to pick a term, but also ask a specific matter for comment about this when we, you know, we publish the exposure draft. Tim?
Yeah, I just want to say, I think it's really important that we carry on doing this work, which we started in the PAG, about what are the really important numbers. And I just wanted to flag, because I don't think I sent it to this group. We just carried out more than a year of research on national NGOs in 10 countries about their financial health and the inadequate cost coverage they have. But one of the things that really jumped out of that research was the low level of unrestricted reserves. And in kind of talking with both the national NGOs and their funders, how few people were even aware almost of the importance of the unrestricted reserves and reserves on their financial health. So it does, and if you look at their accounts, yeah, the number doesn't even often isn't even there. So I think there's something about this that we really need to unpack fully and try and give due prominence to unrestricted reserves in particular as a number.
Okay, so I think from that it's definitely not equity. We're talking about something that is more than just net assets. So distinguishing it as funds, reserves, accumulated funds, patrimony, whatever you call the term, it's something specific for the sector, and maybe we just need to kind of reflect a bit more on that. And then to Tim's point, clearly restricted and unrestricted is a fundamental distinction, and should be of interest and should be highlighted, I think, is what's coming from that research. So if we go with that sort of steer on that, Jeff?
Yeah, I just want to add one thing, since you mentioned restricted. In the write-up, it talks about funding restrictions, but also talks about legal restrictions. I just want to caution to be careful there, because obviously in for-profit financial statements, and there are all sorts of compensating balances, collateral, and all sorts of other restrictions that don't emanate from donors or grantors and so forth. And those aren't, those are typically identified through disclosure as opposed through net asset or whatever we call a fund classification. Just want to be careful there not to make our notion of restricted overly broad.
I mean, one of the issues that's been going around in the Sainsbury debate on revenue is what is enforceable, and it seems to me that is directly relevant to this, that actually it's only restricted if it's actually through some form of legal enforcement. Just actually saying, I designate it as this, and it's restricted.
Agree on that. Yeah, we like in US GAAP, we would call that designated as opposed to restricted. It's internally set aside. But I was just thinking about, again, the source of the restriction, just being careful whether we really want to have a really broad notion or make it more associated with funding from grantors and donors and so on.
Yeah, so I think we do need to be careful about that, and probably that notion of legal enforceability as opposed to designation, as Jeff has put it. I think that if we can get that in. Sam, final comment, I think we'll probably need to respect people's time, those for whom it's an unsafe.
Just while we're on the names of things at the bottom of the balance sheet, I know that unrestricted funds is something we use a lot, but it's not commonly understood by the man on the street. And restricted is, but it's a bit like unqualified audit opinion. It just gets people confused. But general purpose, possibly, or I was thinking about reserves, even calling it a sustainability reserve for the general reserves, to bring out Tim's point of making it clear to users what that name might be. And we could, do something a bit more possibly creative in the naming of that to really bring out what those things are for, possibly.
Okay. So I think, we at this stage, what we're going to need to do is I think we need to work out what are the principal things here, and I'm definitely hearing we need a specific term because this is important. I think the point's just come out, which is helpful, about enforceable versus designated versus general, whatever, available. Maybe at this stage, in terms of the precise label, we just need to square bracket those. Let's get the drafting right and the distinctions right. And, those may be things where, to go to Sam's point, these may be areas where we try different ideas out on, focus groups and so on before we land. But at least we know we're talking about a label, not a concept in moving forward. I think we're going to need to leave those other questions, Phil, to carry those forward, I think, to the next meeting, because there are some important issues we need to discuss. And I'd rather carry those forward at the moment than try and concertina them.
Yep.
Karen, do you want to, so if we say we'll draw a line at that point in time, Karen, sort of closing comments in terms of next steps, next meeting, etc.
Yeah, thank you. And I just also wanted to acknowledge that we've recorded Ching Chow's comments about financial statements as well, and we'll pick that up. We'll obviously build on the comments that we've got today as we take the drafting forward. Our next meeting is on the 4th of May. At that meeting, we'll be looking at the consultation feedback responses on narrative reporting and financial statements. And we'll also be looking at the drafting of reporting entity following today's discussion, and we'll obviously bring back the points that are carried over. So there's still quite a bit for us to get through as a tag, and we're hoping for the July meeting to have first and second drafts of kind of a majority of the content that will go in ED1. So there's quite a lot for us to pull together over that period. So if there are any comments that you have that you haven't had a chance to express today, or detailed drafting points, if you could send those through to us, that would be really helpful, because as I say, we still have got quite a lot to get through. So the earlier that we see your views on things, the more helpful to us. So please do share. Just one thing I just wanted to flag is that at the moment we are looking at having a face-to-face meeting on the 29th, 30th of September. Following World Standard Setters and IFAS, which would be in London. I'm going to send out an email to find out who would be able to travel to that if we do have a face-to-face event, just so that we can work out whether there is enough critical mass who would be able to attend to make that worthwhile. So I'll be sending out that just a little brief survey shortly to canvas views on that.
And Karen, on that one, then if people can't make the trip, are we looking at some form of being able to attend at least virtually?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so we would run it. I'm anticipating that we would run. It would be set up to be run as a hybrid event, but if there's only 4 of us in the room, we might as well just do the whole thing virtually. So I think it really does depend on who would be able to travel as to what format we take it away in, but we need to start planning the logistics for that. So I just like to get, I know the constant changing environment, but I just like to get your views based on what you know today. So thank you for that.
Okay, thanks for that, Karen. I mean, I'm conscious we've covered an awful lot of ground in the session today. So, I mean, firstly, thanks everyone. I think you've given us a lot of great input, really useful and focused as well, which is very, very helpful. I think we will need to see as a group how we think this is actually working from the point of view of members' input. I think we've had some good papers supporting us from the staff, so that's really, I think that's really helped us. But Karen, I think perhaps we can just reflect out a session when it would be good just to get a bit of feedback on how this is working for people.
Yeah. I would like, if possible, to sort of have a one-to-one discussion with each of you to get your feedback on how things are going and where we're at. I know it's been some time since I've done that, but it feels like this is an opportunity now where the rubber is hitting the road, so to speak, to have those and refresh those conversations again. So I'll be in touch to arrange those conversations.
Great. Okay. Well, with that, apologies for being 10 minutes or so over, but thanks everyone for bearing with us, and look forward to seeing you again in 4 weeks' time.
Thanks very much, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.